Welcome to the Cyber 60 podcast from Lightspeed, where we sit down with founders, CEOs, and visionaries in cybersecurity. I'm your host, Lightspeed partner, Guru Chahal. Today, I'm really excited to speak with Isaac Evans, co-founder and CEO of Semgrep. Isaac built Semgrep to rethink application security from the ground up, so it appeals to both developers as well as security teams. Semgrep has created fast, precise code scanning that actually fits into developer workflows. Since launching, Semgrep has grown to run over 75 million scans a year and just raised 100 million Series D to continue to grow their business. And the most exciting part is last week, they were named to the Gartner Magic Quadrant, quite an accomplishment as a startup. In today's conversation, we'll explore how AI-generated code is impacting this industry and application security.
Yeah, I just read an Anthropic report that was published in October about vulnerabilities in LLMs, specifically how many parameters or how many training samples you need to poison a model. And they found that it was relatively independent of the number of parameters in the model. So if your model had 3 million parameters or 3 billion parameters, didn't really matter.
Isaac believes the balance between traditional tools and AI models is shifting.
So my junior year at MIT, I was an undergrad working on MIT's entry to DARPA Robotics Challenge 3. There's a great video on YouTube you can watch because a lot of these kind of fell over, including our entry during the competition. Yeah. But one of the things I learned from that was that the PhDs working on this project, it was almost as if they had negative security knowledge. Brilliant people. But their security knowledge was, how do I bypass these things so I can get my code on the robot and get my thesis done? It was very striking because if you go look at this robot, it was made by Boston Dynamics. It looked like Terminator. And so I asked myself, how are we going to have great things in the world like autonomous cars and surgical robots and electronic voting if we don't have some real security properties?
And what it takes to build products that both developers and CISOs love equally.
Software is eating the world. Right? Every business is trying to become a software business. And then also that software is very cheap to exploit. And I saw that from my time in government, being able to be both an attacker and a defender. Turns out it's a lot more fun to be an attacker. And that just reflects how easy it is to exploit most software.
Yeah.
So as long as those two things are true, you are definitely not going to slow down software eating the world. So the mission of our company is really, how do we make it more expensive to exploit the software of our customers?
Isaac, thanks for joining us.
It's great to be here, Guru.
Great. I'd love to start right from the top, Isaac. You've got such an interesting story. Starting companies is not for the faint of heart, but that's not really what you set out to do initially. You started a project. Tell us a bit more about what project you started and why, because that's also an interesting backstory, because it's not like the project was in a vacuum. So tell us a bit more about that.
Right. It's a mix of both, really. And as you know, Semgrep is an open source project. For every open source project, you have to achieve product market fit twice. And the first stage is what we might call project community fit before the commercial product achieves traction. In our case, we actually started as EIRs at a VC firm, Redpoint Ventures. I had been convinced by Satish at Redpoint to defer my Stanford PhD offer in order to do that. So I am forever grateful to him for talking me into that decision. But in the early days, we were kind of struck by this fact that when we were undergrads at MIT and we looked at the kind of tooling that we had access to, none of us had even heard of the market leaders in this space. So the Coverities and Vericodes and Fortifys. And we were very security interested people. So my co-founder, Drew, his advisor at MIT was Ron Rivest, the RN RSA. We thought that was the coolest thing ever. We were huge fanboys. And so we loved security, but we'd never heard of the commercial tools that were on the market when we graduated. And so why was that, right? These tools had they were
the securing code.
Yeah, they're securing code, very interesting.
Right.
And then, during this entrepreneur in residence experience, I got to talk with the go-to-market people and the founders of a lot of those companies. And pretty much all of them had the same sales motion, right? It was very top down. It was sold to the executives. Hey, you need to be thinking about security. You need to buy this tool for security. And I also found out that the big tech companies, the Googles, the Facebooks, the Amazons of the world had evaluated these products and generally decided not to purchase them. And instead, they had hired small armies of PhDs to build very customized program analysis for their own purposes. as we were building, we were always fixated in the same problem of how can you make something that is like a great security product, but also something that is a great developer product. And we threw away the first 2 or 3 iterations of what we were working on, even though they had a lot of security traction. Like if this big security team for an insurance company in the East Coast actually flew us out to their offices to talk about one of them, they were super excited. And we were just running into a wall when it came to getting progress with developers, right? Developers just couldn't care less. And so for some of those early iterations, what happened was one of the early team members who had joined us from Facebook had built the internal tooling at Facebook that ended up being what they used for code scanning in like the first 10 years of Facebook's existence, approximately. And it was an open source project called Semgrep. It really didn't have any users outside of Facebook. Mozilla was an early user, but they were about it. And it was just wickedly difficult to use and compile. And so when he brought this up, our initial reaction was, hey, we're really focused on what we're building here. We're in a sprint, and we had gotten distracted before. So we were in startup mode. We were like, we will not consider anything outside of what we were currently working on right now.
Is this like when someone brings you a wheel and you're trying to drag your square wheel cart and you're basically like, I'm busy, don't bother me.
We're in a sprint here, guys. But we were at least, we had a hackathon at the end of that sprint. And at the hackathon, we polished this up and we were actually this thing is better than what we were working on. And so we were at least smart enough to admit that we were dumb and wrong.
No, but that's incredible. So there was a moment when you're like, we've got this sunk cost, but it's sunk cost. This is better.
Yep.
And then you changed the product roadmap.
In fact, Semgrep, it really was barely a product at that point in time. It was really a kind of utility library within a larger program analysis library. But what made it unique was that you could actually customize things. And that was the thing that really appealed to both developers and security people, because when the CISO or the executives bought this big black box scanner, it was kind of imposed on the rest of the org. Hey, this tool is going to find all the security issues. You just put your code in, the issues will come out. Don't ask questions. And it turns out that first off, that has a lot of false positives. That was a notorious issue in the space, because if you're selling to the security team, they want to find all the issues. They don't really care about false positives. That's an externality for them. But if you're trying to build a relationship with the developers, and we think of developers as the customers of our customer, they might use the open source independently. They're never going to purchase it. But if the security team ends up purchasing the commercial version, the developers are the ones who are going to be the customers of the security team.
Right.
And so that was the long answer to your question, but that's some of the early origin story.
It's so fascinating. You identified a problem through empathy. You're a developer. You're like, I've never heard of these companies, but what they are doing is important. I want to write code that is secure. And so you set out to building an open source project that appeals to developers. So that was the first sort of big leap. The second big leap is you find a project that you feel is in some ways a better starting point. So you take your sunk cost, you sort of change halfway through.
Well, the crazy thing was that, when this engineer who built this at Facebook joined us, we didn't even know about this project. Yeah. That's how obscure it was.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's exactly what happened.
All right. So now you're building with it. At some point you decide we have project community fit. Was that a moment? Did momentum sort of slowly build? At some point you're like, wow, we're ready. We should build a company around this.
Yeah. Well, the 3 things that happened all around the same time were that we had some instrumentation on the open source, because it would check to see, we were releasing versions every week. So we put in a version check so that people wouldn't be on too outdated of a version. And we could see that the version checks were just exploding. And so we were at 1 million scans per month or something. Wow. And we had anecdotal evidence that almost all of the FANG companies were using this as well. And we had people coming to us being like, hey, we would like to buy a Semgrep. And this became a joke. We were like, well, there's nothing to buy at the moment. But it was clear that people were finding tremendous value out of this, both developers and security teams. And so we it's also important for great projects to be sustainable. So we were like, we can build a really good business here. And what had changed as well was that, back in the days when those first code scanning products were coming to market, the dominant languages were more like C and C++. And with those languages, you have a lot of language level defects. You can't really write a C program without creating some memory corruption bugs. If you're writing Python, that's just not as big of a concern. right? And so, one of the first open source adopters and then commercial customers was Dropbox. And, I remember back when I was in school, the most interesting security vulnerability that Dropbox had was this bug where you could put in any username and it wouldn't check the password on the login field, right? And that's not a memory corruption bug. That's a application logic bug. But it turns out that a lot of the issues that people were really terrified by were things that were much more specific to their organization that they could never buy from a vendor. And that's still true today. We have, I was talking with a cryptocurrency company, CISO, and he told us, hey, the reason we're buying you guys is because no one on the market today can actually give us the security properties we need. Even you guys out of the box are only getting us part of the way there. But because you've built something that is a platform that we can extend, we're using this to solve like real security needs that we have, not just check the box with compliance.
That's interesting. There's two things I picked up in your answer, Isaac. I'd love for you to comment on those. First one is you're a shift left product. You're very close to the source code, which means, I'm paraphrasing here, A, it's important to be able to customize these products because you're so close to an entity that is changing all the time. It's very difficult for a founder as a company selling to developers to cover all the use cases because developers, by their very nature, are creative and they're creating new things. And the second thing that was actually even more interesting was it's so rare to find a cybersecurity company that has this duality of we want to really appeal to developers, but we also want to build a great security product that CISOs are proud of bringing into their organizations. And there's a natural tension. The CISO, the security team wants to capture list out all 100 bugs.
Right.
But the better way to address the developer is, don't give me 100, give me the one that really matters. So I'm just wowed and I fall in love with the product. Like, thank you for saving me because this would have been horrible. And then gradually you show more. Is that, how do you navigate that?
Yeah, that's right. We have a meme internally that talks about shift left, right, which was a very popular phrase a couple of years ago. The whole idea is, hey, it would be much smarter of us to just find and fix issues earlier and earlier in production, which is true. But the meme that we have is the fire hose of security issues is now pointed at developers rather than security people. And guess what? Developers don't like that. They're even less tolerant. And so you're right that traditionally in this space, false positives have been a huge problem. Right. And it's actually even worse than you think, because if I show you 3 false positive issues as a developer, and then the 4th issue that I show you is the worst vulnerability you've ever seen, guess what? The odds that you actually assess it that way are dramatically lower. You've got a psychological bias from seeing 3 false positives in a row. In fact, I think this is one of the easiest ways to have a negative value security program. And unfortunately, there are a lot of companies who are in this space. Like, we created a big list of issues and then we didn't actually get any of them fixed by the developers. That's not just an academic exercise. There's actually a really fun report about, fun in a bad way. Mozilla, the makers of Firefox, had an advanced persistent threat actor hanging out in their bug tracker. So like, why hack the company? Just hack the bug tracker. And then they would wait for critical security issues to be reported. And then they would go exploit those issues, right? While Mozilla was taking their time, like getting the fix right.
Yeah.
Brilliant. So, now your security program is negative value.
Yeah.
Which is insane. So like, absolutely, like, it's not just about having a great detector in terms of the quality of issues that you're detecting. If you're not getting the developers on board with fixing those issues, you've actually made things worse.
We can't talk about source code security without talking about AI. So we'll definitely dig into that next. But I do want to ask sort of one preamble question to that. You start the company, you raise your first round. What year is this now?
That was seed in 2017.
So roughly 2017, 2018 timeframe, Transformers, papers coming out. Nobody's thinking about applying this stuff to code. Did you have an inkling that there's going to be some sort of a dramatic increase in the amount of code produced, or was that not sort of, at some point you must have thought, holy moly, like we started the right company because number of lines of code is going to go up like that. Was there a moment?
Well, we were keenly aware of that from the start. And one thing that I tell every new hire is a combination of 2 things. First off, that software is eating the world, right? Every business is trying to become a software business. And then also that software is very cheap to exploit. And I saw that from my time in government, being able to be both an attacker and a defender. Turns out it's a lot more fun to be an attacker. And that just reflects how easy it is to exploit most software.
Yeah.
So as long as those 2 things are true, you are definitely not going to slow down software eating the world. So the mission of our company is really, how do we make it more expensive to exploit the software of our customers. To be honest, most security teams are just trying to keep the lights on, right? Like get things running in the first place. But for some of our customers, I was actually just with one of our largest customers in Seattle yesterday on site. And, we went and looked at their bug bounty. So, hey, like people reporting security bugs to them that they pay for. Mm-hmm. And they are actually seeing a shift in the distribution and a decrease in these traditional vulnerability types that they've been targeting with Semgrep, which is awesome to me. So, like my goal for them is I want in a couple of years, their maximum payout for their bug bounty to be 10 times higher. But then the actual dollar value of it's paid out to hackers to be lower, right? So that means like it's harder and harder to find bugs. It's actually getting more expensive to exploit this customer because they're using Semgrep.
So the customer's thinking, I don't need to outrun the bear. I just outrun my friend next door. It's good.
That's right.
All right, let's talk about AI. Now, I'm going to say a couple of things that I'm sure you hear from your customers. Some set might say, hey, we're using AI to write code. It's going to write better code and there's going to be less vulnerabilities. Others might say, we just copy paste the code into Claude or Codex or something, and AI tells us where the issues are. How do you respond? How do you answer these questions? What is Semgrep's role in a world where an increasing amount of code is being written by an increasingly smart set of AI models from an Anthropic or others?
Yeah, we definitely hear both of those things. We don't actually hear a lot of people believing that the AI-generated code is more secure than what their developers are writing. And today, I think that's probably still true. I'm very optimistic that AI will actually eliminate a lot of low-hanging vulnerability classes, right? Hey, this just shouldn't be possible. Other vulnerability classes are much more complex. And the fact that even humans haven't managed to figure out how to eliminate them makes me a little bit more pessimistic that AI systems will be able to. Memory corruption bugs, for instance, in C and C++ involve so much complicated interplay across systems that I think the only way we're really going to get rid of those is by switching to languages that have, formally provable properties. Other things, though, like, hey, you deployed an endpoint and you didn't enable SSRF, CSRF protection. Yeah, AI should definitely be able to be like, bad job, fix that right now.
Right.
And so in some ways, there's just a sea change in terms of like some of the lower hanging fruit vulnerabilities are going to be gone, but there are going to be more interesting vulnerabilities and then new vulnerabilities that LLMs will introduce that we don't even fully understand yet. This is one of the things that I think, as someone who used to work on a reverse engineering project, reverse engineering a traditional piece of software can be difficult, but it's still pretty straightforward, right? At the end of the day, we're dealing with assembly and it might be obfuscated, but you can kind of figure out what's going on if you put enough time and effort to it. For an LLM, as you know, the debuggability is almost non-existent. And the idea of reverse engineering an LLM, there's no human on earth right now who can make sense of looking at a list of model weights, right? Maybe eventually we'll find a way to delve into the matrix. But yeah, I just read an Anthropic report that was published in October about vulnerabilities in LLMs, specifically how many parameters or how many training samples you need to poison a model. And they found that it was relatively independent of the number of parameters in the model. So if your model had 3 million parameters or 3 billion parameters, didn't really matter. The training size required to poison it was relatively small. And what do we mean by poison? Specifically, they're looking at something that produces a super unexpected result off of a very specific trigger inside the training data. And why that is interesting is, let's say that you were a large enterprise like a bank.
Yeah.
And, your source code is not public, but you have internal APIs and those are well known enough that somebody could create a bunch of GitHub repos and create some malicious code snippets that are keyed off of the presence of your internal libraries or APIs. It's
so hold on. This is super interesting. So if I have a product, let's say most of the code is closed source,
right?
But some part of it is open source. It's all sitting in my GitHub library.
Yeah.
Some developer out somewhere proposes a pull request, manages somehow to pollute my open source piece with enough code, small enough piece of code that as AI then helps me write more code, that injected piece of code results in more malicious code being generated. That is a real possibility.
It's a possibility. Like no one really knows like exactly. I mean, there's a lot of variables that are kind of unknown about this, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the training sets are not incredibly public. Like maybe there's some exclusions that happen, but I know that, the teams that are making the foundation models are certainly thinking about this. And that to me is an example of, while AI is going to fix a lot of the old class of low-hanging fruit vulnerabilities, it will introduce new ones that are actually somehow more difficult for us to understand. I actually find that very exciting.
Again,
it's a good time to be an attacker.
Consistent with the theme that attacking is so much more fun.
That I think summarizes, the attitude that a lot of people have. Like, hey, eventually AI should be able to get there where they're just not producing as many of the old types of vulnerabilities, but there are going to be new ones that come along with that. And so
I'm sure that's definitely top of mind for customers. So how do you meet them? These are the customers who are deploying copilots, they're deploying AI agents to write code. How are you evolving Semgrep's product to meet them where they are and where these new sort of surface areas are?
There's let me give you an analogy about kind of like the Semgrep engine, right? Because it's the traditional engine, the one that we started with, is a program analysis algorithm essentially that takes in code and it takes in rules and it gives you a deterministic result. Now, the first thing that we do with that engine, as with any good program analysis, is we parse the code. And that means we strip away the comments. We strip away the variable names, right? Don't concern ourselves with any of that. It's all about the ground truth, like A flows to B flows to C. When an LLM looks at code, it does the opposite, right? It doesn't really think as much about flow as far as we understand, but it certainly looks at comments, it looks at variable names, it looks at function names, file names, all of this context that the application has. So 2 years ago, one of the product leaders on our team wrote this memo called the Convex Risks of AI, because even with GPT-3, people were using it to generate Semgrep rules, and it was great. And that was, before they were even really using it to generate code and stuff. So we were like, how can we leverage this thing? And the first thing that we did was we basically said, let's take this output from the deterministic engine and then ask an LLM to do some judgment calls on, hey, if you were an application security engineer looking at the output of this thing, what would you think? Would you think this is definitely an issue or definitely not an issue? And we'll show those to the user. We'll still show them all the issues, but we'll let them sort by, hey, these are the ones that the LLM thinks are actually a really big deal. And it took us some time, but we've gotten to the point that we now have a stat. 96% of the recommendations made by the LLM, which we call Semgrep Assistant, security researchers agree with, which is pretty good. That's kind of our equivalent of a disengagement rate for autonomous driving, right? If you put this in an autonomous mode, 96% of the time, you're going to agree with what the LLM recommends. And the nice thing about that is you still have the determinism and explainability and debuggability for a developer. It's not like magic. Where'd this come from? You can see exactly how the rules were originally produced. So that's kind of the first thing that we did with AI.
That's sort of like a copilot for Semgrep itself, where I get an assistant that is first parsing through both making sure that the rules are defined the right way, but also going through all the results that are coming back and say, okay, these 3 things we probably should look at right now. The rest would probably wait,
it's like you've hired, another AppSec person to just look through the backlog for you ahead of time so that when you show up, you get to look at the things that are probably the most important.
Right.
And the effect of that has been pretty profound. We've always focused on, hey, how do we get our customers to 0 false positives or as close as we can to that point? And in the early years, people would do that by customizing the engine a lot, right? Some senior security people would come in, they'd be like, hey, at our company, this is definitely an issue. That's definitely not an issue. That took a lot of work. So customers would get there, but it would take some time. This year has been the first year where we've actually had customers, not all, but many customers during the evaluation period. They said, hey, the reason that we liked you guys was at the start, you were really good. And by the end of our proof of concept, there were no false positives in the results that we were looking at. And that's the reason that we picked you guys.
I've always thought of Semgrep as having this incredible opportunity, because of the nature of the product, to track what was identified as a potential issue and how did the developer judge the urgency of that, and how quickly did they address the issue, because you can look at the commits, right? So you have this unique opportunity to build in reinforcement into the product itself. Are you thinking about stuff like that? Because it feels like this would lend itself really nicely to sort of this beautiful loop of constant improvement in a very customized way for that developer, for that module inside that company.
Yeah. So I promise I didn't tee up this question, but one of the features that we added last year to Semgrep Assistant is this ability to, let's say that we find a security issue. We comment on the pull request.
Yeah.
And we're like, hey, this is an issue. And then the developer replies and they're like, well, actually, it is, but this project is, my fun project. Like, it's not actually being deployed anywhere. Then that reply goes into a queue that the security team can look at and can be promoted to become a memory for the system. So you can say, hey, like this memory, and you can scope it as well. You can say this memory will apply to this file, to this repository, or to the entire org. And so now we have just an English description way to capture feedback from the developers. And you'll also get a preview of if we promoted this memory, if we made this part of the feedback loop, what would that change, right? Would it mark 100 things as false positives? Would it introduce 100 new things? And so teams love that because now they actually have a way to respond to developer feedback that is very easy and lets them preview how they're evolving the security of their system, but still be in control of the security properties that they're responsible for ensuring.
That's amazing. And then going back to, how you're evolving the product to meet the new surface areas, are there partnerships with the Anthropics of the world, the OpenAIs of the world, the Cursors of the world, et cetera, that are also relevant in this context? Like, how are you evolving that piece?
So there's a ton there. The first thing is, as soon as you get rid of the false positives, by the way, customers come back and they're like, hey, like, are we finding everything? Because we have customers who have actually gotten to inbox 0 for security vulnerabilities for the first time.
Yeah.
Right. And so then they come to us and guess what? They want more coverage. And so we have been using LLMs to generate Semgrep rules. That's what I mentioned back with GPT-3. And the great thing about that is now you still are leveraging the creativity of the LLMs, but you have a deterministic system that the developers can see this is exactly the sort of things that we're looking for and checking. This is not publicly released yet, but we have one customer for whom we've generated 5,000 rules. And by comparison, all of the like open source Semgrep rules, there's about 2,000.
Oh, wow.
So for one customer, 5,000 rules is a like huge milestone, right? And there's some great work going on with Anthropic right now. There's a partnership that we have with them where Claude is being fine-tuned, or fine-tuned might be the wrong word, but there's a reinforcement learning environment where we are like training it to better produce Semgrep rules. So it's actually now my preferred way. Like I was, the rule syntax was one of my original contributions for better or worse. And now I'm just like, yeah, just let the LLM write it. It's so much better.
As an Anthropic fanboy, I appreciate you working with the team.
And so that's kind of on like the security research side. In terms of the broader public, there's a partnership that we announced with Replit that I'm really excited about. As you know, one of the vibe coding platforms that's just exploded. And Replit developers don't necessarily look like typical developers from 10 years ago, right? They're much more novice, inexperienced. They just wanted to get it to work as fast as possible. And what really impressed me about the Replit team was that they anticipated that there was going to be a backlash against this. And so they were like, hey, how can we, just starting with even the open source product, get some baseline guarantees that some of the low-hanging fruit we're knocking out with this product. And so actually the since they've come online, the number of like scans and developers that we're protecting has gone crazy high. I mean, GitLab is already using the open source as well. And so we're now estimating probably 20 million developers a month are getting, Semgrep scans on their code, which is awesome.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
20 million.
Yeah.
Holy moly. That's great. I want to talk a little bit about, look, at the end of the day, you've built an incredible company that is a huge foundational resource for developers. But on the business side, you sell to CISOs. So things like trust in the ecosystem matter. Gartner is a big part of that. You have some big news from a few weeks ago to share. Tell us a bit more about that and why it's important and what does it mean for Semgrep?
We do. Yeah. So we are officially going to be in the Gartner Magic Quadrant for application security testing, along with the traditional players like the Checkmarks, Vericodes, Sneaks of the world. I'm really excited about that. We at this big meeting with the customer who's like, one of our top 10 customers by revenue that we had yesterday, I had never met the CISO of that customer. And they've been a customer for like 3 years, massively expanded. And so much of our go-to-market has been very bottoms up through practitioners who looked at the tool, said, hey, this is really good. In fact, what they told me was originally they had a different commercial product, and just using the open source, they were getting better results than the commercial product that they had paid for. And that is very much our story, right? So for us, the journey has really been, hey, not every company adopts products that way. I kind of wish that they did because I love the practitioner-led motion. But many teams, have different priorities. They need like executive alignment and buy-in. And so the journey for us, which actually Lightspeed has been a big part of, has been, hey, like how do we build a sales and marketing organization that knows how to meet not just the high-tech Silicon Valley companies, but the rest of the world where they're at. And that to me is really exciting because it goes back to that mission of, hey, how are we going to get this great technology and actually make it more expensive to exploit software in the rest of the world?
I think I'm glad you mentioned that last piece, Isaac, because I think a lot of very technical cybersecurity founders often, really love interacting with these Silicon Valley customers, very sophisticated. But at the end of the day, selling to the larger 50,000, 100,000 enterprises out there that could be potential customers is aligned with the mission. And the mission for all of us is to have a more secure digital ecosystem. And so I'm glad you said that. Like it is a core part of company building.
The deep motivation back for me. So my junior year at MIT, I was an undergrad working on MIT's entry to DARPA Robotics Challenge 3. You might remember the first DARPA Robotics Challenge was drive an autonomous car through the desert, at the time, crazy, right? Yeah. The second one was an urban environment. The third one was a firefighter robot. And there's a great video on YouTube you can watch because a lot of these kind of fell over, including our entry during the competition. Yeah. But one of the things I learned from that was that the PhDs working on this project, it was almost as if they had negative security knowledge. Brilliant, brilliant people. But their security knowledge was, how do I bypass these things so I can get my code on the robot and get my thesis done? It was very striking because if you go look at this robot, it was made by Boston Dynamics. It looked like Terminator. And so I asked myself, how are we going to have great things in the world like autonomous cars and surgical robots and electronic voting if we don't have some real security properties? If it costs $10 to exploit all of this software, that's not going to work. Yeah. So that's very much the mission that it comes back to.
Security in the foundation itself. I'd love to focus a little bit on you and your journey as a founder. You started as a very technical founder. Today, you're running a very large company. You just raised $100 million. Your business is doing really well. You're running over 100 million scans pretty soon. Tell us a little bit about your personal journey. How do you hire, especially in executive staff? How do you deal with that tension between how much to offload, how much to be in the details? Because there's this sort of, all of Silicon Valley goes through this. You must delegate. Next day, you must never delegate. You should be in the details. So how do you navigate that?
I'll tell you a story. Back in the early days, I was still coding, even though I was the CEO, coding a lot. And one of our investors, Jim Getz over at Sequoia, told me I had to stop coding. I was like, well, you can't tell me what to do. He got my co-founder, Drew, to send him a report from the Git repository of, how many lines of code I had written every week. And
that sounds like Jim.
Exactly. Yeah. He was right. I did need to stop coding. First off, a big part of it was that I'd always kind of shown my value to the team through technical contributions, right? And so for me, the first transition was realizing, hey, that's not going to scale. My technical contributions to the team are over. And by the way, I've hired people who are actually a lot more talented than I am at making these technical contributions in the first place. And so then my role is much more about the leadership and management of the team. That was a difficult transition to make. It was certainly the first one. And as you've alluded to, the next thing was the market transmission, hiring a professional go-to-market team. Actually, when Lightspeed invested, our sales leader had no professional sales background at all. He was a former product leader from another successful startup who had just kind of stepped into that role, and it had gone really well. But it wasn't something that, at the end of the day, we believed was going to scale. And that was a difficult realization to come to for both me and for this leader. I think that's one of the hardest things, especially for someone who is a first timer in the job, to come back and be like, hey, I don't think this is going to work. We're a victim of our own success here. This is a great problem to have, right? Like we're growing so much. We need to bring in somebody else for this next stage of growth.
Yeah. What's your management style? Jensen famously has 50 people reporting to him. Others prefer 5 or 6.
Yeah, I have 10. I think there's a lot of virtue to Jensen's approach.
Yeah.
But if you listen to him carefully, what he says is that the reason he wants to do that is that the managers below him, the line level managers, should have as few direct reports as possible. And the top executives at the company should have the most reports because they should be the best leaders. I'll never forget when I heard him explaining this, right? He's like, because the alternative to them being the best leaders is that they're not the best leaders. And that's terrifying. I like the approach of, hey, let's have a flat organization. I don't think I'm a good enough leader to have 50 direct reports. I wouldn't put myself in that category.
It's a good goal to aspire to. I want to go back to one point we discussed a little bit earlier. The difficulty in cyber of selling to both the security teams, but also being a well-loved product by your actual end user, which in this case is our developers. Any advice for founders who are now thinking about building products that need to appeal to both of those audiences? Or another way to think about this, if you could go back differently, would you do anything differently, or do you feel you made the right set of decisions? And any advice for the founders who are also going through the same journey?
That's a great question. I want to be careful. Internally, I use the phrase loved by at least a few developers. We have a Slack channel where we get constructive feedback from users, whether they be security and developers. And there's plenty of people who are still like, this security thing, I don't know. Because ultimately it's slowing them down, right? Like a developer wants, yes, they want to produce secure code, but more importantly, they want to go fast. And so the more that we are enabling them to go fast is more a function of how bad the other tools in the market that are slowing them down are than necessarily us being perfect at it. I think the biggest piece of advice, and we did a lot of this early on, which is what led us to abandon some of those early product ideas, is you just cannot spend enough time talking to end users and customers. So one of the things that we came out of, just very fresh in my mind, 14 hours ago, at the end of this QBR with this big customer, we said, hey, we want to go talk to a couple of your developers. Even though they have no buying power, they have no economic agency, right? We want to talk to them. We actually want to shadow them. We want to put one of our engineers next to them and watch what their workflow and experience is like using the product. And to me, I think that's been one of the biggest lessons as someone who's a technologist, who loves technology, who gets very excited about it. At the end of the day, the value of your business is determined by the customer's perception of it. And so if we really believe that the developer is the customer of our customer, wow, you got to spend a lot of time soaking it in with them.
I love that recommendation. It also applies more broadly too, right? You could be selling to a security operations engineer. You could be selling to a vulnerability management engineer. It doesn't really matter. Walk in their shoes.
Right.
You're going to go and do a QBR with the business leaders, with the people cutting the check. Why not the actual users who are actually hitting your dashboard on a daily basis? That's a great suggestion. I want to transition into a set of rapid fire questions. This is my favorite part of these interviews because that means you're not prepared for these. but I promise you they're easy questions. Let's start from the top. So in 5 years, will more code be written by humans or machines?
Well, definitely machines. I don't know if you want a longer answer. I feel like a lot of code is already written by machines, even before AI in a lot of ways. And so in some ways that's semantic. I think this is one of the best things that's ever happened. And there's people who are like, I was interviewed by Business Insider about vibe coding startup that got hacked. And they were like, is this just, vibe coding is so bad. And I was like, well, look, I think this is great, right? Like enabling more people to do more with technology is just so obviously good for the world. The only concern is how do we make sure that they actually are able to keep up with the security guarantees that are needed in order to ship their application. Not everybody needs nation state level security. In fact, most people don't, right? And so you probably just need some basic hygiene things, which is why that Replit partnership is so interesting to me.
Right. That then leads me to the next question, which is what is the most underrated risk as we are moving into that world where a vast majority of the code is written by AI? Some things are already on our radar.
Yeah.
More code, got to be careful. Is there something that's top of mind for you, just given you're at the frontier of this stuff, that the larger enterprise hasn't yet?
Like I alluded to, I guess, I feel like a lot of the people who I respect in the space are really in a posture that there are unknown unknowns when it comes to vulnerabilities with LLMs, right? And if you believe that they are just a different kind of intelligence, we don't know what kind of mistakes they'll make. They'll spot more mistakes of ours that we probably didn't see before. And then there will be things that are mistakes they make that are very difficult for us to see. And going back to the kind of our lack of ability to really penetrate the model weights and understand the full properties, that's why I think Anthropic is doing some great work
in mechanistic interpretability.
Let's interrogate this. Let's try to use our intelligence to understand what we've created there. But truly, it's a frontier.
Is there an internal AI research team you've spun up just to sort of start thinking about these things?
There is actually. So we just published some really great stuff, and we can put a blog post link in the description of this episode. Okay. But we did some benchmarking on Claude versus Codex versus Semgrep.
Right.
And one of the things that I think is interesting is On public data sets, these models are a little bit overfitted, and so they do really well at finding security vulnerabilities in public data sets. We were talking with one of the winners of the DARPA AI Cyber Challenge, and their observation, which is held true for us across customers as well, is that those efficacy rates drop a lot when analyzing private code bases. I'm kind of fascinated by that, but we've got some great visuals on, hey, like what was the degree of overlap between our product, which still is winning by a healthy margin. So, breathe a sigh of relief there. But like, what are we finding? What are they finding that we're not? And then that really speaks to this kind of like question of, hey, like this is just a different kind of intelligence, and we are kind of like I alluded to. We've got the deterministic Semgrep engine. We're post-processing that output to filtering it down. We're using the LLMs to generate rules to find more things, coverage. We're also working on some internal stuff that has not been publicly announced yet, but truly using the LLM models in a hybrid mode with traditional program analysis. And that is a very exciting frontier project that the team is doing some great research on.
That's awesome. I want to read up about that.
Absolutely.
As a CEO, so far in the company's journey, your proudest moment?
I'll give you the one that comes top of mind. Somebody at the, we just did a big offsite in Lake Tahoe, got the whole company together. Someone came up and said, hey, I just want to tell you, I feel like I'm doing the best work of my life at this company. And to me, that's
awesome.
Made my week.
Yeah.
Right. Because if we're creating an environment where people feel that way, it's, to me, like there's a lot of great economic success that you can have at a company. But if you haven't created that kind of environment for people, what are you really doing?
Yeah. That focus on culture, that's really important to you.
Absolutely.
How do you maintain that as you continue to scale? Because clearly you have been able to. Is there something active, or is this just who the founding team is and the executives are, and that transmits into the org? Is it active, or is it more passive, just a reflection of who you are?
It's very active. I think that all cultures tend towards disorder and decay. And so we're very paranoid about how do we preserve the culture that we have. My co-founder, Luke, does a culture talk. It's basically indoctrination with everybody who joins. One of the founders does a culture interview with everybody who we hire, before, as part of the hiring process. There's plenty of more work to do, but we think about it a lot. There's so many companies that economically are doing great, and then the culture is just not there. And I agree with, was it Reed Hastings' Culture Eats strategy for breakfast?
so flip side of the proudest moment. If there was one decision you could go back in time and change, what would that be?
Oh, man. Well, there are many. One of the early mistakes that I made was, we hired a couple engineers, very talented, brilliant engineers. And I don't think I was a great leader or manager to them in those early days. And also, I failed to appreciate how much the early startup environment is just this violently uncertain place to be. And some people get out of, it's like a roller coaster. Some people come off of that and they're like, yeah, let's do it again. Other people are like, hey, I'm a little sick and I might need to leave the park. They were very empathetic, and like, we just tried to make it work for longer than we should have. Like, the reality was it wasn't working for either of us.
It's interesting. I've gone through similar founder journeys. I find it's not a reflection on the person, it's a reflection on the fit. And,
absolutely.
And if both parties view it that way, and the culture in the company is such. This is before we started
doing culture interviews.
Yeah.
Right?
So if the culture in the company is such that let's make sure we're the best place for you to do your best work.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's not possible, that's not a reflection on you, it's on the fit at the firm. It's just so much easier to do this. But I love that suggestion. Most founders, especially at the speed at which your business is scaling, other fast-growing businesses are scaling, you're focused on hiring and that right filter and lens, but not necessarily on identifying when it's not working. So important.
That's right.
I doubt you have time for books or podcasts or other resources, but is there something that you feel that like, wow, that's interesting, I would recommend that to Guru or other founders?
The one that was recommended to me by Drew Houston at Dropbox was The Effective Executive. This was many years ago.
Okay.
And it's pretty short. It's a good read. I've found myself referring back to that over and over again. The other one that has become like a cultural, just part of the culture at the company, is The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. Just super helpful for, when you're like, how come this isn't working? People want to get things done. They want to work. And so being able to get down to, well, what's really going on a team, that's helped us time and time again. I recommend those two to new managers a lot.
Great suggestions. Final question. If you were not building Semgrep, what would you be doing right now?
It's a great counterfactual. I find the intersection of law and technology really interesting. And, because I worked in an intelligence agency for the government, this whole concept of an intelligence agency and a democracy, they're kind of fundamentally opposed forces in some ways. And so I had a really interesting PhD offer to do some work in this area about how can you take cryptography and actually use that to give more privacy to members of the public, like people who are using technology services, while also giving the kind of access that is very valuable for intelligence agencies who do have a legitimate job to do. And so there's really cool stuff on homomorphic encryption and private information retrieval that we could talk about if we had more time. But I'd probably be doing some research in that area.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
It's one of those areas where research is super interesting, building business is super hard. So I'm glad you're building Semgrep and not homomorphic encryption.
Believe me, I know.
Isaac, thank you for taking the time. This has been so wonderful. Semgrep sits at such an incredible intersection. One of the largest impacts of AI today has been in software engineering. You're right there on the front lines. We're excited to see how you continue to navigate this brave new frontier. Excited to be on this journey with you. So thank you for that. And thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Great to be here with Lightspeed.